My name is Andrew Bennett. I'm the director of the North American Action Team at the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. The North American Action Team looks at a number of issues related to religious freedom in the domestic space. And today I want to broach the topic of resurgent anti-Semitism in the United States and also North America more broadly. I'm very glad to be joined today with two good friends of the RFI, Rabbi David Saperstein and Rabbi Mark Dratch. Rabbi David Saperstein is the Director Emeritus of the Action Center for Reform Judaism in Washington and former Ambassador at Large for the Office of International Religious Freedom at the State Department. Rabbi Mark Dratch is the Executive Vice President of the Rabbinical Council of America. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you. So this is obviously a difficult issue because no one likes to see anti-Semitism grow, especially in a place such as the United States, but we've seen over the last number of years a surge in anti-Semitic incidents, anti-Semitic sentiments, which have been documented by a number of organizations, the Anti-Defamation League, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and various other advocacy bodies, and also by police services across the nation. So I wanted to ask you first, from your perspective as Jewish leaders in the US, what do you think are some of the factors that are driving this resurgence? And David, why don't we start with you?
Sure. There's a confluence of a number of factors going on. One is the growth of right-wing extremist groups who have long held anti-Semitic views and made anti-Semitism a centerpiece. So that is true in the United States, it's true in Europe, it's true in a number of places with the growth of authoritarianism, here the growth of xenophobia, in part exacerbated by the unsettling of mass movement of migrants across the globe that often evokes a kind of disparaging view of the other, the stranger, in their midst. So that's one big piece. Secondly, we've seen on the left growing manifestations of anti-Semitism in the United States, in Great Britain, in other countries across the globe. Often it is connected to Israel, which raises a third dynamic of this, the moving away from traditional sources that motivated anti-Semitism or expressed anti-Semitism. Here, the politicization of Israel as an issue, being seen here as the perpetrator of significant evil by others, and the denial of the Jewish people to have their own national identity expressed in Israel, has become yet another source of anti-Semitism. And finally, I would just add, I don't think this is much less true in Canada right now, here, but or this administration in Canada, or the prior administration in Canada, here, but in the United States and a number of European countries, particularly in Central Europe, the growth of voices at the leadership level of the country that is heard by extremists as legitimization of their acting on their views, I think has greatly exacerbated this problem. It's led to more hate crimes, which we can talk about later, but I think those factors, the stamp of approval coming from some of our leaders, political leaders and civic leaders across the country, the growth of right-wing anti-Semitism and the resurgence of violent expressions of that, the growth of left-wing anti-Semitism, all of these factors have brought us to unprecedented, alarming rates of anti-Semitism and expressions of anti-Semitism, at least in the post-World War II era.
Mark, what's your perspective based on what David is saying about these sort of trends that we're seeing? Are you seeing something similar from your vantage point?
I think we're seeing the same thing. I think David summarized them very, very well. I would just add the issues that the COVID pandemic has contributed to this as well, because we've seen historically, and unfortunately we see now as well, that when there are economic downtrends, when there are pandemics such as we have now, when people don't have good answers to resolve issues that they're facing, very often that leads to anti-Semitism. So if you look at the memes, at the tropes, if you look at the things that are being published now, they are very evocative of things that we've seen, caricatures of Jews that we've seen, things that are said against Jews in terms of whether they're in control of the economy or in control of various parts of society that have been rearing their ugly heads as well.
Well, maybe just let me expand upon that and come back to you, Mark. You know, we see various forms of anti-Semitism. David highlighted some of those. As you mentioned, there are these very old, sort of pernicious forms of stereotypes of Jews and the Jewish people. And then we have, you know, sort of newer forms that we see, denial of the state of Israel's right to exist, denial of Jews' right to perform Aliyah and return to Israel. What do you see as the most threatening forms of anti-Semitism today, or forms that we need to pay particular attention to combating?
Well, I think there are a number of things. I think in general, we're still at a better time today than we've been historically, although certainly not within our more recent experience, but we're certainly at a better time than we've been historically. All of that being said, the accounts of Jews being attacked on the street, especially Orthodox Jews who are identifiably Jewish, is something that we've seen, whether it was murders in synagogues or whether in a grocery store in New Jersey, or whether it's Jews walking on the streets of Brooklyn. So I think that is particularly pernicious because people's health and safety and welfare and very lives are in danger. I think the anti-Semitism that's disguised as anti-Israel or anti-Zionism also becomes a very, very dangerous issue that we're facing at the moment as well.
Mm-hmm. David.
I would just add to that, the studies done by the ADL and a number of groups that monitor anti-Semitism explain that the most violent anti-Semitism tends to come from the right, from organized groups. In Europe, it's a little bit different because some of it comes from migrant communities as well. But the growth of the right in almost every country in Europe, in ways that we never thought we would see again after World War II. The attacks on synagogues, on Jewish day schools, on Jewish institutions, harassment on the street, in many places in Europe, and the articulation of anti-Semitic message from organized groups on the right is truly frightening. Here, I share Mark's concern about the growth of anti-Semitism from the left in terms of Israel, not only in the sense that it's a danger for Israel, but internally in the Jewish community. This creates a real problem about how to think about Israel and puts pressure on people. You know, there are a lot of people who are troubled by Israel's policy. I know none of them who aren't equally troubled by the anti-Semitism about it. So for many Jews who are liberal left, which tends to be the profile in North America of significant segments of the Jewish community, it is a very kind of schizophrenic dilemma to deal with it. Both in the United States and in Israel, and about the United States and about Israel, we wish we could express our severe differences and criticisms and policies we disagree without having that result in attacking the fundamental recognition that these two countries play a very special role in terms of values that we hold precious here.
And I want to come back to this issue of sort of left and right and how that plays out of anti-Semitism. But I want to come back, David, to something that Mark said, which is about increasing attacks against Orthodox Jews because they're very visibly Jewish. And you've spent a lot of your time over the last decade or so working specifically on religious freedom. And there are those who would argue that anti-Semitism is fundamentally an issue around racism or an issue of prejudice that's not related to religious freedom. But given what we're seeing vis-a-vis the Orthodox community, can we say that this is really attacks against those Orthodox Jews because how they live a very public faith, and then it comes down to a question of religious freedom more than simply a question of racism or racial profiling?
And so a couple of fast responses. I presume many of those who will see this video are aware, Andrew, that you held the same position in Canada that I held in the United States, and we work very closely together on many of these issues. And I'm assuming I speak for both of us in saying that there is a very, very interwoven connection between ethnicity, minority status, religious identity, racial identity amongst many groups. They're all woven together into the identity of the particular group of people we're talking about. You can't really separate them out. So it doesn't matter to me if there are also racial aspects of the persecution that a particular group is facing that has a religious identity, if there are ethnic characteristics beyond their religious beliefs here. It is still an issue of religious freedom. At the same time, it implicates all of these other concerns. Look, the Nazis were very clear. They didn't care whether we were Reformed Jews, Conservative Jews, Orthodox Jews, agnostic Jews, assimilated Jews here. They were going to destroy the Jewish people, and they identified anyone with one Jewish grandparent as being Jewish. That too was based on a pseudo-racialism, pseudo-scientific racialism that emerged in the late 1800s here. So anti-Semitism is both religious identity and other identities, but I see us all being in this together. Here, I would hope no Reformed Jew would stand by as ultra-Orthodox Jews are attacked in Israel and the streets of Brooklyn or anywhere else. And I would hope no ultra-Orthodox Jew would stand by when Tree of Life sees non-Orthodox Jews targeted. We're all in this together. We have the same stake in how it turns out. We can work best when we work together on these issues, and Rabbi Mark Dratch and I have had the opportunity to work together on many such issues over the year, and we have common values and common interests, and this is one key manifestation of that.
Yeah, I think that's something very important to emphasize, and certainly to really emphasize for our viewers that there's a very strong solidarity, I think, within the Jewish community around the question of combating anti-Semitism. And Mark, coming to you now, just commenting on that last question that I posed to David about the Orthodox community. The Rabbinic Council of America is obviously sort of an umbrella group for modern Orthodox rabbis and congregations. What are you seeing from the perspective of your members? What are they seeing in terms of anti-Semitism? And maybe if you can speak a little bit to any contact you've had with some of the more ultra-Orthodox communities and what their perspectives are.
Right. So one of the concerns that we have certainly on a local level are just the safety of people in the streets or in the synagogues. COVID has kind of complicated those matters and made things a little bit easier. But certainly in the past couple of years, tremendous amount of budgets have been going towards hiring guards to stand in front of the synagogue on Saturdays, on the Sabbath, when people are coming for services, of upgrading the infrastructure, the hardware in terms of cameras and other types of things, screening people, training volunteers also to be able to stand guard and to protect and protect the community. But this is something that we've never seen before, certainly not in North America. Certainly was something which was very prevalent in Europe, but certainly not very prevalent at all in America, and we're beginning to see more and more of that. And it becomes complicated now with COVID as services are being held in people's backyards or in public areas. How do we make sure that our people feel safe and protected and are able to come? So that's something that we're seeing across the board, not within the Orthodox community, from ultra-Orthodox through modern, and in the Reform and the Conservative and Reconstructionist communities as well. I think what David said is correct. Whatever differences we may have in theology, and some of them are very, very significant, we see ourselves as one people, and a people that is responsible each person responsible for the other, and each part of the community responsible for the other part of the community, and those types of threats of safety know no boundaries.
You know,
And you've had similar attacks on Orthodox communities in Canada as well, Andrew, in recent years. So this is it is a North American dynamic.
absolutely, and there's a really interesting story, David, that came out of Quebec, sort of at the height of the quarantine, at the height of the lockdown, when all the synagogues were obviously closed for services, and communities of Hasidic Jews in Outremont, in part of Montreal, where most of the houses have little balconies on the front of them. And what would happen is there were these wonderful stories of ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic men coming out on their balconies to form a minyan, sort of a distanced minyan, and beginning to have the various services each day from their balconies, and you could hear these prayers echoing across the streets of Outremont. And the story was sort of told by a fairly secular Jewish guy who was in this neighborhood, and how at one point they couldn't form a minyan, and so he just stepped out on his balcony and began to pray with them. So it's interesting how not only has the pandemic been a challenge for many religious communities in terms of how they worship, but in this case, in this part of Montreal, it was actually a tremendous example of public faith being manifested with what is a typically somewhat closed community within Montreal. They were forced by the pandemic to form a minyan across their balconies on a side street in the center of the city, and it drew people out. So a wonderful sort of story in the midst of all of this.
That is
this question of
story.
Yeah, beautiful story. I want to come back to this question of left and right, and just ask you to explore this a little bit more on the domestic scene. Do you think that there are sort of new left-right dimensions within US politics around anti-Semitism? Has it become politicized in some way? I'm thinking in particular of some of the manifestations of Al-Quds days on US campuses, or the BDS movement. What are your thoughts on the challenge that these types of newer manifestations of anti-Semitism pose to the Jewish community? David, you talked about how there can be sometimes this tension around valid criticism of Israel from within the Jewish community, yet also standing together to defend and support Zionism. So I'd like you to both of you explore that a little bit more, if you could.
Yeah, well, let me start with that, and then David can fix everything that I've said. I think we're seeing a politicization of everything, certainly in the United States these days, because of the nature of people who are in government and the way civilized debate and disagreement has gone by the wayside. And so we're seeing, I think, a resurgence of anti-Semitism both on the right and on the left. I think there's certain people in power now, elected to Congress, for example, that are well known, who have been known to be much more outspoken and using anti-Semitic tropes and language. And then the response then becomes magnified because of the left-right divide in the United States. So it becomes very, 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 very complicated. I think with an upcoming election in the States, we're seeing those on the right and the left accusing each other of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel stance in ways that we've never seen before. And the depersonalization of people who are involved in public life leads to this type of thing. At the same time, you're mentioning the university, the college campuses, we're seeing much more activity, much more anti-Israel activity that's leading towards anti-Semitism as well. Jewish students who were part of student government councils, other types of things being voted out because of their identification as Jews or as supporters of Israel, and student leadership being much more vocal in terms of their anti-Zionism or anti-Israel stances, which, as I mentioned before, in many ways is really just a cover for anti-Semitism as well. So the Jewish students on campus are finding it very, very difficult these days. What that will look like when eventually they're able to go back to campus, I think will be very complicated.
David.
No, I agree with that. I fully agree with it. I think Marcus summed it up very well.
Just to move on, talking about universities and moving on now to education, do you think that the current programs that are available educational programs, whether at the primary, secondary school level, university level, awareness raising programs about Jewish life, about the Shoah, about the Jewish community to American life, are as effective as they could be? What would you like to see done differently? And how can some of these programs be strengthened to combat resurgent anti-Semitism?
Well, first, there are a number of very good resources that are available for schools to use, any kind of school to use, public schools, private schools, who care about developing respect for different groups, understanding of different groups, celebrating diversity, seeing that as a strength. And let me just mention a few of the sources of this. The World of Difference of the Anti-Defamation League is a classic resource used widely throughout the United States. The American Jewish Committee has just come out with a new resource called Translate Hate, that it will be very useful. The Holocaust Museum brought on Deborah Lipstadt, one of the most renowned scholars in the history of the Holocaust, to help develop new materials for the schools. I haven't had a chance to look at them. I presume they have begun to be issued or will be very soon, but anyone who's interested can contact the Holocaust Museum for resources here. And then you have groups like non-Jewish groups like Facing History, who tries to find constructive ways to deal with the realities of our past in moving towards a better future. So, just off the top of my head, Andrew, those are a few of the key resources. And what I have heard from schools that have used almost any of these is how invaluable they've been and successful they have been. Whether or not it is having a difference at a national level is a harder question to answer, and the data is not at all clear on that. But for those who have the opportunity to participate in them, it clearly has an impact.
Mark?
I think that's so, but I think to a certain degree, there are at least two factors that are working against the success of these types of programs. One is a sense of Holocaust weariness. Many people, younger people, don't want to hear about it anymore. It was a historical event. It's something that's behind us. It's been politicized to a certain degree, and I think that there's certain weariness in the public, in terms of the public in general. I think that's one issue. And I think a second issue is that Jews are generally not perceived by the larger community as a minority and as an oppressed minority. So the focus when it comes to anti-racism needs to be on people of color rather than on Jews. When it talks about economic issues or political issues, it's on others, and it's not on Jews. So to make that argument in the public square sometimes is very, very challenging.
The one question that I'll conclude with is, speaking as the one fellow on this call with a Roman collar on, what are the roles that can be played by other faith communities to stand up as champions for the Jewish community? Whether we're speaking about Christians or Latter-day Saints or Muslims or Baha'is or other members of different religious communities in the United States, how can they take a role in becoming champions for the Jewish community and being able to stand up against anti-Semitism and what it says about the threats to our common life as citizens? Mark?
Well, we've seen a number of advances in that area in the last number of decades, certainly following Vatican II and Nostra Aetate. There's been a whole re-understanding and rereading of Christian-Jewish relations. And some of that went to text and liturgy, some of it went to understanding some very fundamental stories within the Christian religion. And part of that was understanding Jesus not as the Christ, but Jesus as a Jew and what that means. So I think that that's important. And I think that people of all religions need to look at ourselves in terms of how we understand the other and what our stories and founding myths have been in terms of the roles that others have played and the demonization sometimes of the other. And I think that becomes important, and that needs to be ongoing. Because if a generation, if 50 years ago that happened, what are the conversations that are taking place today with regard to that? And that has to be internal, because for Jews to come to a different community, to a Christian community, and say, you must reevaluate, you must, is not our place, and will certainly be counterproductive. So I think in terms of it's every group accepting responsibility for itself, for what its narratives are and what its and how they play themselves out. So I think that's one thing. I think we also need to understand, and probably in the work that the two of you did in the Canadian and the United States governments in terms of religious freedoms, talks about this as well, that when one religious group is oppressed, all religious groups are oppressed. And so anti-Semitism is not just a Jewish issue. It's an issue of all religions and of all minorities. It's the canary in the mind that when Jews are oppressed, it's not going to be so much further that others will be as well. And I know that in our work, in filing amicus briefs, for example, as a Jewish community, we look at all religious freedoms. And sometimes my members will come to me and say, why do we have to have an opinion about whatever the issue is? It's not a Jewish issue, but the answer is that it is. And even if we might disagree with the theology or the particular policy, I think we all need to look out for each other, because all of our freedoms and all of our safety are really dependent one on the other.
David.
Yeah, I agree with you. So the one nuance refinement I would make, Mark, because you've been part of such efforts successfully, is I'm not sure that where we see entities who are ignoring this problem, that are engaging with them, usually most effectively behind the scenes, to try to challenge them on their silence on these issues and motivate them to step up, to confront some of the theological, some of the functional, practical issues of anti-Semitism that surrounds them or emanates from their own community, is not an effective way to function. The Catholic Church changed in part because of ongoing dialogue with Jewish theologians, with Jewish figures, with Jewish community leaders over the years. And the Catholic Church's clear statement, it was not the Jews who killed Jesus, that the Jewish covenant continues, and more recently, the affirmation that the logical conclusion of a Jewish covenant continuing is that salvation in heaven is accessible without without belief in Christ. Here has been a major breakthrough and spurred other religious groups to similarly think through their own thinking on these groups. But we are all in this together. I mean, that's the one, if there's any lesson from the Holocaust, it's what happens when good people stand idly by the blood of their neighbor, as Leviticus warns us against. Here, none of us can win a battle like being persecuted alone. When we stand together, we can do things none of us can do. And Andrew, as you well know, in Canada and the United States, throughout the world, here, this is a golden day for interfaith relations. Interfaith relations are happening on a global level that we've never seen before in human history. And in the United States, it's become almost institutionalized in every community in America, that there are interfaith clergy groups, there are interfaith coalitions addressing the problems of their members, their synagogues, churches, mosques, temples, and broader communities. So this is an extraordinary time. And let me just conclude by saying the obvious, that we're talking about the problems. America still is a country that, because of its constitutional promises, that our rights as a citizen would never depend upon our religious practices or beliefs or identity here, and the way that our religious freedom was assertively implemented from the 1940s on by the Supreme Court, that we have known rights and opportunities in America that we've known nowhere else in diaspora life. It's an extraordinary country for us. And with all the problems we're talking about, anti-Semitism, in Canada, 19% of all hate crimes are aimed at Jews. In the United States, Blacks are targeted by hate crimes more. Here, but of all religious groups, far and away, the Jewish community is the target of that. 58% of all hate crimes against religious groups are targeted at Jews. So we're focused on this. But let's not lose sight that polling data of the American people also shows that if you ask, who do you think, who would you be comfortable supporting as president, and here a Jew, a Muslim, an evangelical Protestant, mainline Protestant, a Roman Catholic, Jews now end up at the top of the list. So different from 50 years ago. Here in the ADL polling data, is very 79% of Americans, Jews, have a strong emphasis on family life. 70% Jews have contributed greatly to life in America. It's also, we shouldn't lose sight of the positive. Things on which we can build through these interfaith relations to really make a difference.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. And I think obviously at the Religious Freedom Institute and the North America Action Team, we're looking a lot at the First Amendment and the role of the First Amendment in helping to shape the United States. And a friend of mine once said that these fundamental freedoms are like these delicate orchids. You have to really nurture them and nurture them and nurture them, and not sort of let them just sort of go to waste. They really need to be strengthened. And I think, as you pointed out, David, the depth of religious dialogue and engagement that we have in the United States and Canada really can be an example to other parts of the world. And I think on the question of anti-Semitism, we have to remember two things, I think. One is to continue to speak about it, to continue to promote education around it, to promote engagement by various communities to stand up and to champion the Jewish community, but also to remember that at the core of our religious freedom is living out a public faith. And it's when we live out a public faith that we can engage with one another. And as you so rightly said, and Mark, as you alluded to as well, it's in that engagement that we can come to know one another and truly build our common life. So thank you to both you, David, and Rabbi Mark Dratch, Rabbi David Saperstein. Thank you for joining us. For more information about the Religious Freedom Institute, the North American Action Team at the Religious Freedom Institute, please go to our website, rfi.org. Thank you very much.